At 12 years old, he was selling illegal substances in the Marcy Houses. By 30, he was signing artists, and by 50, he was worth $2.5 billion. Jay-Z has released 14 #1 albums, sold 125 million records, built a champagne brand, a streaming platform, and a sports empire. Some say he did this through hard work alone. Others say he did it by exploiting the people around him. But how exactly did a kid from those blocks build all of that, and who were the ones he betrayed to do it? Join us as we explore how Jay-Z quietly became a billionaire. The label and the contracts. Some believe hip-hop's first billionaire built his empire by betraying every person who helped him get there. That behind the Armani suits and billion-dollar deals lies one of the most calculated schemes in entertainment history. Yet, as we are about to show you, the real answers are far more diabolical. But to understand how, we'll have to first go back to the very beginning. Before Jay-Z ever signed a record deal, he first watched others get destroyed by it. Raised in a small yet chaotic neighborhood plagued with the crack epidemic, gang wars, and endless street vices, Shawn Carter learned the art of being opportunistic from a very young age. It was how he and many other young men ran the block, and this ability to use people to advance his status would reflect in how he partnered with others at the peak of the music industry many years later. The first person to fall in Jay-Z's endless quest for power and influence was the famous artist and producer Jaz-O. In the late 80s, he was the one with the connections. He noticed Shawn's talent and took him to London. Jaz-O booked all the studio sessions and positioned himself as the man who was going to launch Jay-Z's successful music career. This would prove to be his biggest mistake, but before then there were bigger problems on the horizon. At the time, Jaz-O had signed with EMI under terms that gave him very little control and even less money. He thought he was in the music business, but in reality, the contract he thought would bring him fame and fortune was the one thing working against him. And from that contract, the label took his work, owned the masters, controlled the distribution, set the recoupment terms so high that even a successful album left the artist in debt, and then moved on to the next one when the money ran out. Jaz-O's career eventually collapsed, and though he had been a tremendous help to Jay-Z in helping him move out of the Marcy Houses and give him a shot at the industry, Jay-Z walked away without batting an eye. Many saw this as a betrayal, but Jay-Z saw it as an opportunity. From Jaz-O's mistakes, Jay-Z had learned the right framework to use for getting the most money out of an artist's success, and he would spend the next 30 years using that framework to exploit other people. Yet to do that, he had to first make his own record label, but he wouldn't do it alone. With help from Dame Dash and Kareem Biggs Burke, Roc-A-Fella Records was launched in 1995, and the label started as a distribution deal with Priority Records before moving on to Def Jam not long after. But before that, they needed to sign new artists, and among the artists he approached to sign with the label were Jaz-O and the rapper Sauce Money. Jay-Z and the others had built the label with the intention of getting as much money and musical assets from the signed artists for as long as possible. So when he offered the deal to Jaz-O, the numbers felt low. So low according to him that it reportedly felt insulting. And from this fallout would come 15 years of fighting between both artists, beginning with Jay-Z's rapid rise to popularity. The first major release was Jay-Z's debut album, Reasonable Doubt. This came out in June of 1996 and was distributed through Priority Records. It was considered average by the mainstream media, but that success came in the form of his second album, In My Lifetime Volume 1. It dropped later that same year in 1996. His third album, In My Lifetime Volume 2, Hard Knock Life, came out 2 years later in 1998. This was the album that changed everything, as it came out at #1 on the Billboard. And that wasn't all. Shortly after getting a Billboard #1, the album went 5 times platinum, and the tour that followed grossed more than $19 million and became one of the highest-grossing rap tours in history to that point. By all metrics, the tour was a huge success, but Jay-Z had noticed a huge problem. What looked like a partnership between 3 equal founders was slowly becoming a deadly corporate battlefield between them. Each of them wanted to make more than the other, and the artists unfortunate enough to sign into the label would find out the hard way. The new artists and bigger controversies. One of the scandals that often plagued the music industry back then was that an artist who makes an album might end up not getting a fraction of the money the label makes from it. Roc-A-Fella wasn't an exception to this rule, and the first artist in its roster to suffer from this was Beanie Sigel. He was one of the most highly respected rappers in that era. His album in 2000, known as The Truth, was well-received and commercially solid. Most critics believed it was one of the strongest debut albums of that year. But the terms of his contract meant the label would take a very high percentage of the profits plus the added costs for studio time and promotions. Jay-Z was also featured on some of the songs, and that was heavily charged from the profits as well. When the math was done, Sigel barely made any money from an album that had made a great deal of money for the label. And years later, Beanie Sigel found out something else. Jay-Z personally owned his masters. All his songs belonged to the label entirely, along with all the legal rights on how to use them. Another artist that suffered the same fate was Memphis Bleek, and his situation was a lot more striking because he and Jay-Z had grown up together. Bleek and Jay-Z went way back, yet their relationship did not change any aspect of the deal. Industry insiders have estimated that Jay-Z has made millions from Bleek's catalog over the years, while Bleek himself has spoken about remaining financially dependent on Jay-Z for much of his adult life. Sigel and Memphis weren't the only ones. Freeway, another artist who signed under Roc-A-Fella, released the Philadelphia Freeway album in 2003. The album was a huge success, with commercial numbers strong enough to set him up well for a lifelong career if he played his cards right. The problem was that the recruitment terms in his contract took more than the album generated, somehow leaving more debts and obligations than any significant income for him. Meanwhile, Jay-Z would keep collecting from the sales. It was during this time when Cameron and the Diplomats came in as established names with leverage, but even they ended up in a deal that transferred master ownership to a Jay-Z entity. Cameron was one of the first artists who pushed back in the middle of his work within the label. He wanted more control, royalties, and independence. In response, Jay-Z's label responded with reduced promotion and tour support until the situation resolved itself by him leaving. All of this happened because Jay-Z had studied what Jaz-O went through, applied the same principles, and built a roster where artists brought in the talent needed to print money. But most of the money and the entire legal ownership would belong to him and his company. But things got a lot worse when Kanye West came around. Kanye first came to Roc-A-Fella as a producer, though he was also interested in being an artist. According to Kanye in an interview years later, Jay-Z and Dame Dash were not interested in letting him rap because they were making too much money off his beats. So his initial deal was designed to keep him in a producer role and financially dependent on the label. Kanye had to build independent buzz, create his own movement, and essentially force his way into being taken seriously as a rapper before Roc-A-Fella would support the college dropout project he had been working on. He eventually got that deal, and the album launched one of the most successful careers in hip-hop history. But the entry terms still gave better bonuses to him as a producer and even greater returns to the label. And just like the others, Kanye West barely made anything from the entire project. Yet a greater scandal was on the horizon. The betrayal. No one expected. For several years since Roc-A-Fella was established as a record label, Dame Dash believed he and Jay-Z were building an empire together as equal partners. Not only was he wrong, but he also had to find out the hard way. And the story of how he got betrayed is still one of the most discussed stories in the history of hip-hop. And as we'll see, the way this happened was beyond diabolical. By the early 2000s, Roc-A-Fella Records had become one of the most powerful independent labels in hip-hop. While Jay-Z did his essential part by releasing great albums that funded everything while finding fresh talent and presenting record deals to them, Dame was the person doing the heavy lifting on the ground. What Dame did not know was that Jay-Z had been having private conversations with Def Jam executives for months. Jay-Z was not going to be a business partner anymore. He was going to rule the entire business alone by himself. Soon, it was announced that Jay-Z sold Roc-A-Fella Records to Def Jam, and further negotiations had made Jay-Z the president of Def Jam. Jay-Z had become his own business partner's boss, and he didn't know about it until the agreement officially went public. The company Dame had spent years building beside Jay-Z was now a subsidiary of a label that Jay-Z was running, and Dame had not been part of a single conversation that led to that outcome. The other person who launched Roc-A-Fella with Jay-Z and Dame was Kareem "Biggs" Burke, and he too was excluded from the negotiations. He had been part of building Roc-A-Fella from the beginning, and the deal was structured around him as well. Yet, they didn't know about any of this until the rest of the world knew. Dame's main source of income was from Roc-A-Fella, so to avoid going broke, he was forced to sell his stake in Roc-A-Wear, the clothing line he and Jay-Z had built together, for much less than it was worth. Jay-Z sold it a few years later to Iconic's brand group in 2007 for over $200 million, over 10 times as much as Dame sold his share. He also retained a licensing deal that allowed him to continue profiting from the brand even after the sale. Dame saw none of that upside and has since spoken openly about what happened and what it cost him, not just financially, but in terms of how it reshaped his understanding of who Jay-Z actually was. Yet that wasn't all. Jay-Z had a much bigger ambition in mind, and he didn't mind bringing the industry to its knees to do it. The king of the industry. Becoming president of Def Jam in 2004 was not just a career move. He did it to gain influence over a new generation of artists whose commercial success would benefit him in ways that lasted long after he left the job. He wasn't after the hip-hop industry anymore. He already had that in the palm of his hand. He wanted everything the industry had to offer, and he wanted to take it all for himself. Many popular artists signed under his leadership. Among them was the now famous singer and music legend Rihanna. She became one of the best-selling artists in the history of recorded music, yet was forced along with many other artists to sign an even more exploitative kind of contract. The new contracts he offered were master ownership structures that would keep paying him royalties after he retired as president. With endless wealth after retirement now guaranteed, Jay-Z left Def Jam in 2008 and founded Roc Nation. This would be a full-service entertainment company covering music, sports representation, touring, and management. The business model at Roc Nation was built on the same principle that had worked throughout Jay-Z's career. What he accomplished from this point was unbelievable. Among the athletes signed by Roc Nation Sports were Kevin Durant, Robinson Cano, and Victor Cruz. The representation deals carried some of the most aggressive commission structures in the sports business. And the long-term brand relationships and business opportunities that came from those relationships were designed to benefit Jay-Z's wider operation rather than profiting the athletes. With each signed contract, Jay-Z made every client financially dependent on him. Megan Thee Stallion testified to this. Her management openly said that any contract signed with Jay-Z was built more around creating dependency than building the signed person's career. She wasn't the only one to openly speak out about this, as J. Cole opened up as well, saying that though he was able to talk Roc Nation into giving him the right platform and creative freedom to make it big in the industry, he described Jay-Z as a guy who didn't really care that much, and the financial structure limited his ownership rights over the long term. Still, he was lucky enough to leave with a fair deal with Roc Nation and Universal Music Group, but now the public was more aware of Jay-Z's business tactics than ever, and this brought in lots of backlash, as it became clear not just to artists, but fans across different industries. His contractual practices were too greedy. In response to this, something very interesting happened. Jay-Z was now ruling a huge chunk of the sports and entertainment industries. He just got there, and to stay on his throne, he needed the world to be on his side for as long as he could. So in 2015, while it seemed the world was starting to recognize Jay-Z as a greedy opportunist, news broke that he had just bought the streaming platform Tidal for $56 million. On top of that, he had reportedly relaunched it as an artist-owned service. Jay-Z planned the press conference that announced the relaunch, making sure it featured some of the biggest names in music. Among these were Beyoncé, Madonna, Rihanna, Kanye West, Alicia Keys, and others. They were all presented as co-owners who were taking a stand against streaming platforms that underpaid artists. For a while, it seemed Jay-Z and these artists were on the side of those aspiring to make it big in the industry and were looking for the right platforms to make it happen. But this is where it gets interesting. As part of the arrangement, all the music stars who advocated better payment from streaming platforms received equity stakes in Tidal. As pointed out in an article by Variety magazine, this was allegedly the plan all along, but meanwhile, the smaller artists on the platform, the ones whose presence was used to build out the catalog and justify the subscription model, did not receive equity. These smaller artists were on the platform. Their music was being used to attract subscribers, but they were not part of the ownership structure as they were promised. This fact became most obvious in 2021 when Jay-Z sold Tidal to Square, the financial services company run by Jack Dorsey, for over $300 million. That was a return of more than 400%, and that was just 6 years after his initial investment. As for the smaller artists who had been part of the platform's identity and catalog, they received nothing from that sale. Of course, the superstar partners received their equity returns. Jay-Z walked away from that deal with the largest share. And the smaller artists found out about the deal the same way everyone else did, when it was announced publicly. Now, here is the part of this story most people never know. Becoming a billionaire. Despite the many reported exploitations, what many don't realize is that music isn't the biggest fraction of Jay-Z's current wealth. To answer the question of what made him so rich, we have to move to an entirely different industry. Armand de Brignac, the champagne brand also known as Ace of Spades, was a brand Jay-Z had started promoting in his music and videos around 2006. To the world, it looked more like an endorsement deal, but in reality, what many didn't know was that it was actually an ownership stake. He had acquired an interest in the brand and was using his cultural influence to build its value before anyone outside the business relationship understood what was happening. Later on, in 2021, LVMH, the French luxury conglomerate that owns Louis Vuitton and Moet Hennessy, acquired a 50% stake in Armand de Brignac. And that deal alone valued the company at almost $1 billion in total value. Douce Cognac followed a similar path. Jay-Z partnered with Bacardi to co-own the brand, and then he used his platform to build it into a premium product with serious market share. In 2023, he sold half of his stake in Douce back to Bacardi for a reported $750 million. Add that number alone to the hundreds of millions he makes from the music business, and we've accounted for most of the alleged $2.5 billion fortune. Contrary to what many believed in the early 2000s, Jay-Z never accepted endorsement deals or ad sponsorships without owning a stake in the companies behind them. He never promoted a brand he didn't own a part of, and the world would repeatedly remain oblivious to that fact until he sells it off at a very high price. He would be called to advertise a niche product. In response, he'd buy a majority stake in that product, promote it into being a luxury brand, and then sell it off at 100 times its original value. This distinction is the entire story of how Jay-Z got rich. He was not paid to promote things. He owned things, waited, and sold when the value was there. His art collection includes works by Jean-Michel Basquiat and other blue-chip artists and is also estimated to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars on its own. His real estate holdings across New York, the Hamptons, and Los Angeles add another layer to his level of wealth. Add to that his streaming income, publishing rights, and touring revenue, and his total net worth today begins to make a lot of sense. He is, without question, one of the most sophisticated business minds in the history of the music industry. He came from a neighborhood with no infrastructure for the kind of wealth he eventually built, yet his experience with the drug trade from a very young age made him able to study the industry from the inside out. And with that, he single-handedly figured out a system that made him a billionaire in an industry where most artists retire with almost nothing. That is the more obvious part. The not-so-obvious part was the system he built on other people's backs. Beanie Sigel, Memphis Bleek, and Freeway made millions of dollars for Jay-Z, but hardly broke even after the label took its cut. Dame Dash built a company that Jay-Z eventually controlled and ultimately profited from more than anyone else did. The smaller artists on Tidal gave the platform cultural weight that Jay-Z eventually sold for hundreds of millions of dollars they never saw. From Jaz-O's mistakes, he learned the art of using people and their ideas to push further and beyond, and he applied it to everyone who did business with him. He's known as the man who finessed the top dogs of the music industry, and the result is a $2.5 billion empire built over 30 years through shady practices and near illegal terms. That is the true story of how Jay-Z quietly became a billionaire. Either way, let us hear what you think in the comments below. Is Jay-Z truly a genius like fans believe, or is he just a con man who used others to get ahead? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Black Status for more videos like this. Now click on the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it. Until next time, take care.